Hello everyone, and welcome back. We're gonna do another video, and I'm gonna stick with this sort of format of doing deep dives into particular topics so that we can, get a very good understanding of everything that you need to know in order to understand it. So we're gonna be talking about topology. So let's get going. All right, so we're really gonna be talking about two things here: topology and edge flow. So, what is topology? Topology describes the structure of your model. The positions of the vertexes, the edges and the faces that make up your model in 3D space. That is essentially, the topology of your object. And what is edge flow? Edge flow describes the way that edges flow around your object. And generally speaking, it's good practice, for reasons that we'll get into in this video, to make sure that your edge flow follows the curvature of the object. And it becomes fairly important when you are trying to make certain kinds of models, especially if you want to make a person, if you want to make anything anatomical, if you want to make really anything. It's important that the edge flow is good and that it makes sense with the way that your model is built, essentially. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. So one of the reasons that we always tend to, in 3D modeling, be working in quads, which is fairly important. If you're building your models, you might want to triangulate models for export for other applications at a later date. But generally speaking, when you're building models from the ground up, you want to be working in quads. And there's a particular reason for that, and it is because of loop cuts. And we're going to spend a decent amount of time talking about loop cuts in this video, because proximity loops and loop cuts are important for a whole bunch of different things. But what are they? I'm sure if you have gotten to this video, that you know what a loop cut is already. But essentially, if you have an object and you hit Control R in edit mode, it will place a loop cut. And this is a loop cut. It will go around your object and it will subdivide the mesh along a face loop, essentially. So if I go into face mode and I'll click here, you can see it selects this whole loop of faces around the object. And so if we wanted to cut all of those faces in half, that would be a loop cut. So a loop cut will divide a face loop. Now, one of the things that's really important here to understand early on is that loop cuts actually won't travel through n-gons, essentially. So anything that is not a quad, which is why we tend to be modeling in quads. So let's say, for example, that we have this default cube here, and I want to place a loop cut down the center. If I put if I have more geometry here, if I have loops along this way, and then I place a loop cut this way, it will go through these other loops here, and it's because these faces are quad. But now let's say, for example, that I were to change the topology of this model and take one of these quads and cut them in half. So now our model has tris in it, and what you'll see is that if I try to place a loop cut here, those loops stop when they get to the tri, and they can't go through. And it's the same for faces that have more than 4 vertices as well. So loop cuts will go through quads, but they will not go through triangles or n-gons. Now that's important for a couple of reasons, starting with proximity loops. So if, for example, you have a mesh, right? And one of the things that we commonly want to do in 3D modeling is to subdivide a mesh, which essentially means to cut all of the faces into smaller pieces by adding more divisions. And you can do that manually. You could do it with a multi-resolution modifier. You can do it with a subsurf modifier, which is this modifier here that I just added. And if I turn this on simple and apply it, what you'll see is that it subdivides the mesh, but it does that using loop cuts that it's placed through the model, right? And if you have a model that has tris or n-gons in it, this subsurf modifier is actually not going to work correctly because it's not able to place loop cuts all the way through the object. So let's say you've got, for example, an object that looks like this, looks totally fine, but the topology on it is like a disaster. Like, it's got triangles, it's got n-gons, it's doesn't make any sense whatsoever, and the edge flow is also bad, so the edges are flowing in all different directions. What'll happen when we apply a subsurf modifier to this is you'll see that your mesh looks ridiculous, right? And it's because it's not able to do loop cuts perfectly around the object, or all the way through face loops, because those face loops are divided by n-gons or triangles or whatever. And that, combined with the bad edge flow, is going to give you all sorts of problems if you subdivide the mesh. So you're going to get like weird shading issues, you're going to get weird divisions in your topology in ways that you might not expect, and it's going to cause all sorts of problems. Now there's another reason that this is important, and it's because you want to be able to do loop cuts. So if you remember, the subsurf modifier won't work if you have n-gons and tries, because it is based in loop cuts, but you also won't be able to use normal loop cuts that you would place manually, which are important for what we call proximity loops. So if I take this cube here and I subdivide the mesh several times, you'll see it gets this sort of spheroid look to it, and that's because on the Catmull-Clark version of the subsurf modifier, it's interpolating the distance between the edge loops that it's adding and averaging them out. If we go into simple, then it would just subdivide the mesh and not actually transform it at all. But I'm going to leave this on Catmull-Clark for this, because this is something that you'll use quite a bit in order to sort of smooth out geometry in your meshes, right? And if you wanted to, say, sharpen up an edge, so say you've got this thing, but you want it to be sort of flat on one side and then sort of come to a rounded point, you could do that by adding a proximity loop. And you do that by going into edit mode and with Control R, adding a loop cut here. And you can see that as we drag that edge closer to the end, it sharpens up that point. And it's because there's more geometry here at this point here because of that second loop that we've added, right? So there's an extra face loop here. And that means that the subsurf is going to divide the mesh more in this area than it is, elsewhere, wherever there's less geometry or fewer face loops, right? Because what it's going to do is it's going to put an edge loop down the center of this for each level of subdivision that you add, essentially. And if you wanted to, you could sharpen it this way too and get that sort of rounded cube look. But you can imagine that if you have a mesh that is made out of tris and n-gons, you wouldn't be able to do this, right? And this becomes really important when you want to have sort of smooth, you want to smooth out your mesh, but you also want to have areas that you sharpen, right? Because it's pretty typical to have areas that are very smooth or very rounded. Like we could drag this edge loop out here, right? And this would become more rounded. But then you also want to have areas that are more sharp, and you would do that by, adding proximity loops and dragging them in closer. So essentially, the closer that proximity loop is to an edge with a subsurf modifier applied to the model, the more it's going to sharpen up this edge like this. And the further you drag this loop away, the softer that edge is going to get. So that's something that's very useful that you're going to find you're doing a lot in 3D modeling. And if you have a mesh that is made out of n-gons and tris and has bad edge flow and bad topology in general, and poles all over the place, which we'll talk about in a little bit, then you're not going to be able to do this sort of stuff, and it's going to be really difficult to get your model to look the way that you want it to. So here, for example, if I were to put a tri here, and then just subdivide this once, right, you see we get like that weird face here. And it's because if I apply this subsurf modifier, maybe I'll actually just turn this to simple so we can see and hit apply. It's divided this in a weird way because it's failed essentially to put a loop cut straight down the center of, it really should have been a face loop here. And as a result, you get like all sorts of weird shading and stuff. Now there is another factor to this as well, and that is, a couple of other factors. Number one is edge flow. You can have a mesh that is based in quads but has poor edge flow, and the other one is poles. So you can have a quad-based mesh, so you don't have any tris or n-gons, but you have poles in places that they shouldn't be. and that can potentially cause problems for shading and all sorts of, you can get weird texture stretching on the surface of your model if you have not been careful about where you place those. So what is a pole? A pole is any vertex that has more or less than 4 edges running into it. So for example, if I make a plane here, I'll just drag this over here, right? And I'll just add a couple edge loops in here. And if I just merge these all in the center, this point here in the center is now a pole. And the reason it's a pole is because if you look here, the number of edges going into it is way more than 4 edges, right? And so this potentially can give you some weird stretching on your object. So I've got 3 planes here, and we're going to look at what happens to these planes when they have poles on them, in order to sort of get a better picture of how poles can distort the surface of your mesh, essentially. So I'm going to turn on proportional editing, and I'm just going to, let's see, I'm just going to drag these out, and I'm going to shade all of them smooth. All right, so let's now have a look at this in rendered view mode, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a mirror material to all 3. All right, so here are 3 materials, and or 3 planes rather, and you can see that they all have a little bit of distortion because of the shape of the object and the way that the light is sort of being reflected around the edges. And you can see that this one here looks pretty good. Like there is some distortion just because of the shape of the object, which is realistic because of course there would be some distortion if you had like, a perfectly metallic object in this shape, that was polished smooth. You would see a little bit of distortion just because of the shape of the object. But it looks pretty okay, right? It's reflecting the environment around it. And then you have this one here, which is, even though it's shaded smooth, it's got like these hard edges here, right? It just doesn't look right. And that's because of, this sort of wonky topology here where you're getting stretching in the middle and then this pole in the center here. You can see that these points are sort of stretching the material in towards the center. And this one over here, which has even worse topology, is, very much the same thing. Right, and where you've got all of this stretching going in, and what it's doing is it's stretching the object in, and as a result, it's not reflecting light properly, right? And this is not to do with the material. So the material on this is just a base color. This is just the pure reflection of the HDRI. So the UVs for these objects are all essentially the same. This isn't a UV wrapping issue. This is because of these poles in the center here, which have more than 4 edges going into them. Wherever you have poles like that, you tend to get some sort of material stretching, regardless of how it's unwrapped. And so one thing to keep in mind when you're building your models is you just want to think about, because sometimes poles are unavoidable. When you're building a mesh, sometimes you will have poles, but you want to minimize them, right? You don't want to have poles everywhere, and when you do have to have them, you want to try and put them in a place where they're going to be fairly inconspicuous, because you don't want the stretching to be obvious. And so as long as you're careful with how many poles you have and where you put them, then you can do a pretty good job of hiding these artifacts. Now you'll notice for this one here on the left that this is still a quad-based mesh. So it's possible to have perfectly fine meshes in terms of whether it contains n-gons or tris, but still have shading issues because of the positioning of poles. And so you just want to make sure that you're sort of conscious of where your poles are and how many of them you have, and try to minimize the number, and for the ones that you can't get rid of, to try and put them in areas that are somewhat inconspicuous. So another thing that poles can affect is edge flow, and I mentioned edge flow at the beginning. And just a sort of quick reminder, what edge flow is it's the way that as the name describes, the edges flow around your model. And obviously good practice is to try and make sure that your edge flow follows the curves of whatever it is that you're trying to create. So if you're trying to create a shape that has curves on the outside, for example, you want to make sure that your topology is following the curves of your model. And we're going to look at an example of this later on. We're going to do sort of a real world example of looking at how you would sort of plan out the topology for a mesh. But just sort of quickly, the reason why this is important, right? Like, why do you care about edge flow? Why is edge flow important to you? And the reason is because edge flow dictates where you can place proximity loops. So if you remember, for example, at the start, right, you wanted to, if you wanted to sharpen up an edge, or after subdividing a surface, you would do using a proximity loop, right? And if you want to add proximity loops, you have to have good edge flow in order to be able to add them in the areas that you want. And the reason for that, of course, has to do with the way that proximity loops work and the way that edge loops or loop cuts work in general. So on this model here, for example, you can see that this has got some pretty weird topology on it, and this is intentional, just as an example. And actually, I'm just going to delete these other examples, and I'm just going to flatten this one out. So let's say that I wanted to add loop cuts in this mesh, and I wanted to add a loop cut that goes down through here like this. Let me just actually brighten up the color of this a little bit. And can I do that? I can't do that. And the reason that I can't do that is because the edge flow of this won't allow for it. So the edge flow will sort of dictate where you can place loop cuts on your mesh. And the way that that works is let me just erase this here. And actually, let's look at another plane. And I'm just going to place a couple of loop cuts in here so that we can see this as an example. So let's say I want to place a loop cut, that runs through here. I can do that. And the reason that I know that I can do that is because of the way that loop cuts work. So loop cuts travel perpendicular to the edge that you have highlighted and along successive opposite edges until either the mesh ends or the loop connects or the loop stops because it runs into a trie or an n-gon that it can not traverse through any further. So in other words, it will travel along a face loop. So this here is, this is a face loop, and so I know that I can place a loop cut here, right? Like that, and that it'll work. And so because of the way that loop cuts work, because of that property that they travel along successive edges until either the loop connects or the mesh ceases, I know that if I place one here, the next area that it's going to subdivide, the next edge it's going to subdivide and connect, will be this one here, because that's the opposite edge. And then the same for this one. This is the next opposite edge from that, and then this one, and then this one. And so I know that that's the direction that this is going to flow. Now let's say, for example, that I had like a face like this plane that was going to be a part of an object, and it had a curved edge that goes sort of this way around the object, right? So I want this to be sort of rounded down here. And you might think, for example, that what you could do is don't need that proportional editing on. You might think that you could just sort of drag these in here like that, and that will give you the sort of the edge flow that you want, right? And this is actually not correct. So this won't give you the edge flow that you're looking for, because if you think about it, right, if you want this edge we want it to continue this way and then around the bend. Well, when it gets here, this is going to go through here, right? And then what is the opposite edge of this? It's not this here. It's actually this edge down here on the left-hand side. So your edge flow is actually going to go like this. And it's a problem because if you wanted to, make, for example, a rim, and that's a thing that you would want to do, if you had like a curved door panel, for example, right? You might want a raised lip around the edge. You couldn't do that with this topology. And for that reason, you have to learn how to design this with appropriate edge flow so that it will allow you to place a loop cut that goes all the way around in the direction that you want it. Otherwise, you won't be able to place those edge loops in, key areas that you'll need to act as proximity loops to sharpen up, subdivisions, to give you, sharper or softer edges, essentially, when you subdivide your mesh. So this right here, you can see if I try to place this loop cut here and use this as a proximity loop, it's gonna go here off the left-hand edge and not continue around the corner. So this would, if I wanted this to be like a raised lip around this bend here, this would be an example of bad edge flow. So this is, not the way that you would want to approach laying out the topology for this shape. And I will show you how to do edges like this. Likewise, over here on this other example, this is just a disaster for a lot of different reasons. We have this pole in the center, which sometimes you will have poles, but we've also got, topology that just runs in all sorts of crazy directions, right? So if I wanted to place a loop cut to subdivide this mesh, it's going to look ridiculous because I can't place them where I need to. They sort of are flowing, all over the place. All right, so let's say that we wanted to make this properly, right? You wanted to get your edge to flow around a bend like this. It's actually pretty easy to do. It's not super complicated, but you do sort of need to pay attention to what you're doing, is that you are watching where the edges are going to flow, or where loop cuts would flow if you place them. So I'm going to make a duplicate of this, and we're going to call this one bad, because this is bad edge flow for this shape, and this one is going to be good. So let's fix this. So you can imagine, if we want to go around a corner like this, really the way to do it is to make a halfazoid, a half trapezoid. This is like only a trapezoid on one edge, and then another one here. And now these are both quads, right? So this is, you've got this 45-degree angle on one end, but both of these are quads, so they will work in your quad-based mesh. But the important part is that this edge, if you tried to place a loop cut here, this is now the opposite edge of that. And so your edge flow is going to travel in this direction, which is what you would want for something like this. So for example, for something like this, what you would do is you would drag this over, and then we could extrude these up, bring this down, and I haven't made this very even. Let's try and even it out a little bit, make it a little more square shaped, and then extrude this over here like that, and then square this face off. And now our topology, if we extrude in this axis, will run around the corner. So you can see that I can place an edge loop here, right, to to sort of go around that bend. And I'll just try and sort of smooth this out a little bit, because it's always also a good idea to try and keep your quad faces roughly the same size. And the reason for that is if you have edge loops that are closer together, when they get subdivided, right, you're going to have more and more geometry in that sort of tight area. And so if you want, a smooth subdivision all over your whole mesh, it's best to have, faces that are about the same size, because then, you're essentially subdividing equally across your whole mesh. And there we go. So this is all quad based. And if you wanted to, place an edge loop around here, you could do that. And just to show you, so you have a little bit more context of like why that's a good thing and why you might want that. Let's say, for example, that this is some kind of metal. Let's give it a metal texture, turn the roughness up a little bit. And you wanted to have like a raised lip on the edge of this, right? You could do that by adding a subsurf modifier. And then let's put some edge loops here and just drag this out, right? And so now you can see that you're getting, we're getting that effect where we have sort of a, a raised edge. And if I turn this up, turn the subsurf up, it'll get smoother. And so this is useful if you wanted to make, like, for, I mean, lots of things like edges on armor, or if you wanted to make, raised lips on like doors and furniture and stuff. This is something that you'll come across quite a bit. And let's say you wanted this to be, maybe sharper on the inside than on the outside. You could do that. Let's hide this for a second. You could do that by, dragging this loop in a little bit closer, because remember, the closer that you put it, the sharper that will get. And let's put another edge loop here at the top, and that will sharpen that edge up considerably. Actually, let's do this one as well, right? And so now, we've got a different effect where we've got a sharper edge there. And if you don't have good edge flow, then this is not achievable. And if you wanted to square this corner off, you can do that as well by adding loop cuts in here and here. And now you can see we've got that raised edge, and we also have a nice clean sharp corner on this piece as well. And so that's looking pretty good like this. I think that's sort of can be useful for different things. But of course, if you don't set up the topology correctly, then this won't be achievable, and you'll be scratching your head thinking, why can't I get this to look the way that I want? So that's how edge flow works and why it's important and how to do it. Now let's look at an actual example of like how would we plan the topology out for an actual item if we were going to model something. So I'm going to bring in a reference photo here so that we can work from this. And the one that I'm going to grab is, what is it called here? Here we go. And I'm just going to lock this object. By the way, you can lock objects if you go down here under this little filter thing. There is this selectable that you can turn off, which by default is hidden. So when you load into Blender, normally it looks like this. I changed my startup file to have this on because sometimes it's just very useful to be able to make an object non-selectable so that you can work over top of it, like reference images mostly. And then you know that you're never going to accidentally move it or select it and be working on this mesh by mistake when you think you're dragging a different mesh. So I picked this object because I thought it would be a pretty good example of edge flow, because we've got some clear areas where we would want to be able to define geometry, right? And when people are starting out, I find it's very easy to sort of get ahead of yourself, because it's fun modeling stuff, right? You want to just make stuff. You don't want to think about it. Sometimes you'd like grab a default cube and let's make something, but before you do that, it can be very helpful to, even if it's just for the first few models until you get into the habit of like thinking about it, to sort of lay out your topology and your edge flow before you actually start, because it's very common, I think, for people to make something when they're just sort of starting out with 3D modeling, and then halfway through go, oh, and the topology is a mess, and none of my edge loops are working, and it's not looking the way that I want. And it's because you didn't think about how to build the object from the start. And yeah, you can clean it up later, but if you get into the habit of like thinking about this in advance, you'll find that you have a much easier time building stuff, because everything will work the way that it should work, because you're not building problems into the mesh as you go. Right, so how would we build something like this? Obviously, probably the best way, this is going to be a sphere, right? So you could make half a sphere and then extrude it downward. But let's look at the edge flow and think about where would we want the edges, right? And obviously we want to be able to place edge loops around this lip, right? Because if you can't, when you add a subsurf modifier, you're not going to be able to sort of extrude and sharpen up this edge here. And so you want to have edges that are following the curvature of the model, essentially. So like here, and all the way up here, and around like so, and then down here to the center. And then you would probably model this with like a mirror modifier so that it's symmetrical, so you would stop here in the center. All right, so for this edge here, what you would probably want to do is like start with, you know, quads running along this bottom edge, because that's what you're going to make that sort of lip out of. And then when you get to this point here, you can just put a trapezoid, or, you know, half a trapezoid, and the same thing here, and then square that off. Right, and so now your edge flow is going to go around this corner like so, and this, right, oops, the rest of your mesh here is all going to be quad based, and so that will work correctly. That'll work, you know, the way that you expect it to. And then this portion here is, you know, pretty straight all the way up, so we can just follow that, and you would have, you know, edges running like this, and the same number of edges coming down here. And then again, we have another turn, and so by just, you know, angling this here, we can create, oops, didn't draw that very well. Let's just say that that's a square, and like, this will go through here and through here, and this is like a 45-degree angle here, right? And so this edge flow is following the edge here and like up around here like that. Now, once you get around areas like, you know, eyes, or, you know, if you're modeling like a person, they'll have, you know, a mouth and ears and, you know, a nose. And you generally want to have edge loops going all the way around those features. It's just, and, you know, it's the same for like where the arms come out, where the legs come out, whether this is a person or an animal, or, you know, other anatomical features. And also for like some hard surface modeling, if you're not making, you know, a person, but sometimes you'll have, you know, a piece coming out of another piece. You generally want to make sure that that edge is surrounded by loops, and you know, that can be very useful. And actually, I'll show you just a quick example why here. For example, if I grab a cylinder, and I'm just gonna put a loop cut here and scale this out like this, and I'll subdivide that and just put some edge loops here to tighten up these faces. All right, now let's say that I wanted to like bring this edge down here, right? It's going to be really hard to do that if you don't have edge loops around the base of your mesh. So like this one here, for example, is like sticking out of this flat piece here, like so, and I want it to look like this, but with more geometry. And so you add a subsurf modifier, and now it looks like this. Well, you need to be able to add loop cuts around like here, like, oops, like here, this edge, in order to like hold that geometry, and that will sort of tighten up that edge. Now, if you don't have a loop cut around this, right, if you don't have any loop cuts around the bottom, like if you're not able to place a loop cut here, then you won't be able to do that. And so that's why it's, you know, important to make sure that if you have, you know, features coming out of other features, anatomical features like, you know, facial features, for example, that you have loop cuts around all of those, so that you can, you know, place proximity loops around them if you have to. So like this one here, for example, if I put a loop here and then another loop around the bottom, you know, you can get sort of a much cleaner edge here, rather than sort of having it stick out. And you need the loop around the base of the object in order to do that. And so what you would want to do here, right, is to make sure that this edge here follows. Let me draw this a little cleaner, because I didn't do this very well. We'll just do it around like this. And then you'll notice right here that we've created a pole, right? And so sometimes poles are unavoidable in your mesh, right? And especially when you have, generally when you have like a circular loop inside of your mesh that's enclosed, or you have, you know, a point where you have an edge flow that breaks off from another edge flow, you're often going to have a pole in that place. And so you just want to be aware that you know, wherever you end up making this this break in edge flow, that you're gonna end up with a pole in that spot. And so you want to just sort of be aware that it's going to cause some stretching. And so you'll want then these edges to continue out here like this. So like that, so that this is still a quad. And probably have another one here, out like this. Let's extend this around the back of the helmet here. It's getting a little messy, but. And then because you're going to have edge flow going this way, right, from here and here and here, you're going to end up at a point where you have to make another pole. So there's a pole here, as well as the one down below. And so you can see that by sort of thinking about this process in advance, we're able to get, you know, very clean topology. We're able to get, you know, loop cuts around all the areas that we want, without, you know, sort of running into problems as we're building the mesh, right? So as long as you sort of think about these things in advance, then it's pretty easy to, you know, to get it looking the way that you want. You just want to keep in mind as you're going that you want to keep a quad-based mesh, and, you know, think about where your poles are going to be and where your edge loops and your edge flow should be, in order to try and approach the mesh in a way that makes sense, rather than building it out from scratch without, you know, knowing where you're going to put your edges, and then, you know, running into problems with topology later on. And actually, this is one of the reasons I picked this as an example, because you could imagine, and I'm just going to erase this here, actually, because we don't need this anymore, that it would be very easy to think that you could make this mesh by going just like this. Right, you would have, you know, this and this. And, you know, if you're not thinking about edge flow as you're building this, you could say, wow, you know, the topology from this is really clean and looks really good, but I can't get this edge or this lip here at the bottom the way that I want it, right? And it's because your edge flow is not rounding the corner. It's just going to continue here, and so you're not going to be able to place proximity loops where you need them. All right, so let's actually make this helmet now, and you know, we'll bring into practice the things that we just looked at here. So I'm actually going to suggest, by the way, before we get into this, that you don't actually build this thing, because I'm going to show you a trick at the end that will make this even better. So this is going to be pretty rough. I'm not going to, you know, spend a ton of time, but we're just going to sort of get like the general shape of this thing. And I will start with a sphere, which I'll scale up and reduce the, it's 20 segments. And we'll just scale it up, and in X-ray mode, delete this. In X-ray mode, delete this bottom half, right? And so that's going to give us like the top of the, sort of the cap of the helmet. And then here, and actually one thing to point out actually while we do this, is whenever you're working with UV spheres, so there are two types of spheres that you can add in Blender by default. Where is it? Mesh UV sphere. If I add a UV sphere here and bring it over, and just go into edit mode, you'll notice that the UV sphere actually comes with a pole at the top by default, and it's just because all of these rings, you know, sort of have to converge somewhere in order to make this shape. And so what'll happen is, and I can actually show you if I shade this smooth and then try to like subdivide this, and we'll probably show a little better in object mode, we get like this weird stretching. You can sort of see it's a little bit subtle, because, and actually maybe I'll put this mirror finish on it, and it'll probably be a little more obvious in rendered view. Yeah, you can see that there's like this sort of stretching in the reflection, and the reason for that is because of that pole at the top there. So just something to be aware of, you know, when you're working with spheres. All right, so I'm going to grab this and just extrude it down in the Z-axis and add a bunch of loop cuts here with Control R. And you should probably know how to extrude, but if you don't, you can alt-click to select an edge loop, and then E to extrude, and I'm pressing Z to constrain it to the Z-axis, and then Control R to add loop cuts. There we go. So this is, starting to look a little bit like sort of the, the shape of the helmet. But then we want that hole here sort of for the eye. So I'm just going to grab a couple of these here at the front, and then like these, and maybe do this whole thing. It's not going to be quite the right shape, but it's close enough for an example, right? And it's just going to delete faces. And so we've got this. It's looking a little more like the Mandalorian's helmet, but that's okay. And I will also shade smooth. And then we want to think about those edge loops, right? Because we currently don't have that edge loop here. Now there are a couple of different ways that you can do this. One would be to like go through and manually change the topology. So like I could do this here, like Control R to add an edge loop, and then sort of drag the point over, and make another trapezoid here to fill that in to actually get our geometry to round that corner. But for faces, there's actually an easier way as well. So if I place a plane here and I rotate it just as an example, and I'm going to subdivide this a few times. So I'm just Control R and scroll up to add more subdivisions. If I hit A to select all and I to inset, you'll notice that it will inset that face, essentially. It'll inset that area that we have selected. So there will be a border around it. You can see that it creates this sort of rounded, going around the bend topology for us already. And so that's one thing that can be useful in certain circumstances. One thing to note as well is that if you try to inset and let's see here, if you try to inset and you don't see anything when you're insetting, this whole thing, it's because boundary is not set correctly. So if I select just one face, so just 4 verts and inset, and then I tick boundary on and then undo that, now I can inset the whole thing correctly. So that will actually work for us over here on this mesh. So if I select all here and inset, it's going to put a boundary around all of the edges here. So I to inset, and you can see that it is placing an edge loop for us around there, and it is making some weird stretching in some areas here, like it's pulling it down a little bit, but you could then sort of clean that up manually and move those verts around to get them where you want. But that's just an easy way to sort of get the type of topology that you're after. So I'm actually gonna add a material to this because it's an okay looking helmet, and I'll add some steel to this and just unwrap it. There we go. All right, so now let's clean this up a little bit. So just from the front, I'm gonna round these corners off by just selecting these 4 and S to scale, right? And so that's sort of rounding those in, and then I'm just gonna bring this one down in the Z-axis, and this whole thing can maybe scale it up a little bit in the X-axis. And the other thing I notice as well is that like this part of the helmet here is sort of angled, like it doesn't come straight down. So we'll just grab these only. Actually, we'll start with this one. Make sure I'm not selecting anything behind it, and rotate just a little bit like so. I'm just eyeballing it because it's just an example mesh, so it doesn't need to be perfect. And I'm going to grab that all the way up to here and just bring this over a little bit so these are a little closer together. And then a lot of helmets have this sort of like shape on the inside where they sort of go in. I'm gonna do that by just, you can, and actually I think this needs to be a little taller as well. So I'm just gonna bring this down in the Z axis. Actually no, I'll scale it in the Z axis a little bit. And it kind of makes the eyes a little bit too tall. I'm just gonna scale it from here down like that, maybe a little better. I know this sort of portion here that sort of goes down actually looks pretty long on this helmet. Anyways, doesn't really matter because this is an example, but I'm gonna grab one of these loops here in the center and O to turn on proportional editing, and just scale it down and scroll to give it that sort of curved profile. And then they've also got this sort of peak at the top, right? So the helmet isn't completely smooth or it's completely uniform. It's got sort of like a little more length maybe in the Y direction, and then like this edge here that goes around. We can also do with proportional editing by just turning this to sharp. Oh, that's my stove timer. But we'll do this quickly. And I'm just going to deselect the ones here at the bottom and I'm only scaling it in Z, and then I'll scale it separately in Y. All right, now, obviously, right, we want to, you know, sort of get this looking more like the one on the left. We need to add a subsurf modifier because there's not enough geometry here, right? You can see some of these edges are straight. And because we thought about this in advance, we have, you know, the loop cuts where we need in order to be able to sharpen up those edges, like this lip around the eyes and around the bottom. All right, let's add a subsurf modifier to this and turn the levels up to like 2 or 3. You can see that we get that nice smooth surface because we have subdivided the mesh quite a bit. All right, so now you know, let's add a lip around this whole thing, and because this whole edge that goes around the base and around the eyes is an edge loop, or a face loop rather, I can alt click to select those, and then I can extrude, and it's just going to extrude out from those origin points. Now I do think it is a bit thin in places, and I can clean this up by just turning off proportional editing and bringing these up. Now in order to sharpen that edge up right, you need to add more geometry, and because we thought about it in advance, that's something that we can do that is not difficult. So add a loop cut on the inside and outside at the top, and now we have that sharper edge around there. Now one thing I forgot to mention actually is, see here, this, oops, let me turn that off for a second. And I should have cleared this up earlier. I mentioned that you should extrude this in order to get an edge like this, but you'll notice if you extrude that you actually get this this sort of weird indent here at the back, right? So it's not extruding outwards from each of the positions. What you can do sometimes is extrude and then don't move it and then hit scale, and that will sometimes give you the result you desire. But really, I think the best way for something like this is actually extrude along normals, which is not in the normal extrude menu. So if you select this face loop and hit search and then look for extrude along normals, that will give you a much better result. And what that's doing is it's extruding those faces outward along the face normals. And if I undo this quickly, if I turn on under here, if I turn on display normals for face normals, you can see the direction of the face normals, right? And so that's the direction along which those faces will be extruded when you use that command. So that's going to give you a much better result than extruding and scaling. Now on this helmet example here, there's actually a problem, which I alluded to before, but it's this pole here at the top, right? You can see that there's this piece here, and it's just not looking quite the way that you would want it to, right? You've got some stretching of the material here, and because this is stretching that's coming from the fact that there's a pole there, this is not something that you can fix by UV unwrapping correctly, or through scaling or adding edge loops or anything like that. This is like, if I re-unwrap this, you'll see that issue is still there, and it's because of the stretching into that pole. And it's because we built this from a sphere, right? We started with a sphere, and I mentioned that at the top of the sphere there is this pole here at the top of the default sphere. So I'm going to show you a trick to get around this, actually. So the UV sphere is built of quads until you get to the top here, and then it's built of triangles. And there is a way actually to get a sphere that is just built of quads, and it's pretty straightforward. So we're going to Shift A to add a cube, bring it over here in the x-axis, and then I'm going to add a subsurf modifier, and I'll just give it, say, maybe 2 levels or 3 levels. Let's give it 2 levels. It's probably enough. And you can see here, right, that this is sort of sphere-like, but it's not completely sphere-like. We started with a cube, and so as it sort of averages and interpolates those extra subdivisions that we're adding, it is not completely spherizing. It's adding, it's still retaining some of that cuboid shape. So what I'm going to do is apply the subsurf, tab into edit mode, and select everything. And then I'm going to search for mesh transform to sphere, and you see that it's pretty subtle, but if I drag in and out, you can see it's sort of spherizing this mesh a little bit. And the way to make sure that it's just 100% spherizing, essentially, is just to click, and then down here where it says factor, we're just going to set the factor to 1. So it's going to completely spherize this mesh. And there we go. And now, if I shade this smooth, you can see that we've got a sphere. And let me add a subsurf modifier to this so that it's even smoother looking. So we've got this sphere now, and at the top, because we made this out of a cube, it's made completely of quads. It didn't start with a pole, so there is no pole at the top, right? So this is a way to get a mesh that doesn't a sphere, essentially, that has topology that doesn't have a pole in it at the top there. And so if you wanted to make that helmet, like out of this, for example, it's you could follow the exact same steps, and it would be pretty easy. We can do it here in just a second. Let me make that a sphere and give this some of that shape. And let's actually give this a material as well. And I'm sort of rushing along here because this is just an example mesh, right? But you can see, oops, I deleted the portion all the way through the back. Oh well. But you can see, how easy it is to do that and to work with that. And now we have a much cleaner topology here, and it's not going to have that weird stretching at the top because it's not made of a default sphere. All right, so I will wrap up there, I think, because it's a little bit of stuff, but hopefully that helps some of you with learning how to correctly topologize your objects in 3D space. So that's it for now. Until next time.